Introductory Chapter, Part 0.1, Artistic Rationale. The possibilities of poem-game interplay are intimately connected to the question of poetry's expansion into digital space. In his essay, Poetry and Hypertext, The Sense of a Limit, Fernando Cabo Asaguinalaza quotes the Nobel-winning poet Octavio Paz, writing in 1991 on the significance of screen technology to the medium. The two great poetic traditions, written and oral, converge on television screens. The page becomes an animated surface which breathes, moves, and changes from one colour to another. At the same time, the human voice, or rather voices, can be enjoined in combination with the lyrics. Finally, visual and sonic elements, instead of being mere adornments, may be transformed into organic parts of the body of the poem. Paz, 1991, 597. Asaguinalaza extrapolates to the computer screen, saying, "It is not easy to find a description that suits better the enticement of the electronic medium for the poet. A screen that breathes, moves, and changes restlessly in contrast with the steadiness of the printed page. The screen is page, but a page of a completely different kind." We may wonder what Octavio Paz would have said had he noticed the possibilities of modern computers to enhance the animated power of the screen and to lend new dimensions and a sense of autonomy to the written word. 2000, para 11 of 26. Similarly, Los Pequeño Glacier has composed a manifesto for digital poetry in the shape of his 2002 book, Digital Poetics, The Making of E-Poetries, in which he argues that, quote, an electronic poetics alters the I and also extends the physicality of reading. With the keyboard, literal manipulation is engaged with fingers determining different referentialities of the text, a sight more active than repetitious page-turning. 2002, 37. It is curious, then, that in the intervening years there has not been more advancement by poets and poetry into the territory of video games, since they are the popular medium most synonymous with the digital age. What video games offer poetry is not just the technology of screen, keyboard, controller, but a significant experiential augmentation. As Keogh argues, players, quote, become incorporated into an assemblage that is the player and video game, 2018-22. Video games bridge the actual and the virtual via multi-sensory feedback, pulling us bodily into their worlds while imprinting themselves on ours. Given that poetry deals so readily in sensory detail through its language, one might expect poets to evince a strong interest in technologies that enhance the reader's experience of that detail, allowing them to touch, see, and hear some of what is being described. Frank O. Copley, writing on Catullus, says that, quote, a poem is itself, it presents its own world to its readers and demands that they accept it as true for the purposes of the poem. 1958-9. If the poem possesses a world, then we can conceive of the physicality of reading being extended by the reader's cybernetic incorporation into that world, making it easier to accept it as real. Additionally, video games present an opportunity to expand the linguistic armory and thus the expressive range available to poets. Multiple 20th and 21st century movements have centred themselves around broadening the accepted range of suitable poetic material, from the Scottish informationists concerned with digesting and transmitting underprivileged data, Price 1994, para 1 of 18, to flav poetry's assimilation and amalgamation of internet detritus. Video game culture, itself underprivileged in arts discourse, represents another frontier of emergent assimilable dialect. Video games are diverse in form and content, rich in visual, audio, textual, and symbolic matter. They also generate a great deal of paratextual material in the form of lore, strategy guides, player dialogue, user modifications, hacks and rewrites, companion fiction, fan fiction, and fan art. If, as Perloff argues, poetry has the ability to absorb and remix the language of televisual media, then all this material has potential to be reformatted and deployed within poetry, not just verbally, but ideogramically, structurally, or imagistically. This is, in short, an abundant new playground for poets, onto which very few have so far dared to encroach. Of what interest should poetry be, on the other hand, to the creators and players of video games? As it stands, video games already engage to some degree in the absorption and remediation of poetry, embedding it largely as filigree and incidental detail within vast virtual worlds. This reflects a wider cultural perspective on poetry as occasional oddity, or at best, marker boy for textual depth. The claim I aim to substantiate in this book is that a far more fundamental engagement is both necessary and inevitable. Video games and poetry share a dominant organizing principle of segmentivity, a term coined by the poet Rachel Blau du Plessis in 1999 and later expanded on by literary theorist Brian McHale to describe an alternative to narrativity as a basis for textual organization and meaning. Where segmentivity is the dominant of a text, meaning is generated by the paratactic arrangement of units. We see them working together side by side rather than, or as well as, reading them start to end in linear fashion. We find significance in patterns and parallels, in coincidence and contrivance, in rhyme and repetition, rather than, or as well as, chains of logic and causation. They rely, possibly to an even greater extent, on players' facility with reading patterns and rhythms as the basis for many of the challenges they set. But it's rare that a video game implies there is any meaning to its patterning and repetition beyond enabling player embodiment and progression. Quite the opposite. Usually narrative linearity is superimposed over the gameplay experience. The player is asked to ignore or forget the rhythmic character of their input and the contrived patterning of the video game environment in order to read the game as a linearly advancing story. The player may watch their avatar die and relive the same moments dozens of times, rewinding time until they make exactly the right decisions, only for the story to proceed as if the avatar were a mere mortal. Footnote: perhaps the most infamous case of this discrepancy is the death of Aerith Gainsborough in Square's Final Fantasy VII. Throughout this game and others like it, members of the player's party may be instantly revived from near death by the use of a commonly available item called Phoenix Down. When the story calls for Aerith to suffer a fatal injury, none of the other characters even considers the chance that she may be revived using this method. Jesper Juhl characterizes this tension as a dichotomy between real rules on the one hand and fictional worlds on the other, rendering games half real. Parataxis, side-by-side placement, is a word that adequately describes the way a video game arranges its components in order to facilitate gameplay, but the tendency of games is to chafe against this design necessity rather than utilize it, in the effort to build meaningful context around that gameplay. It's almost as if video games resist becoming artistic in order to make sense. Victor Shklovsky in 1917 characterized art as a defamiliarizing technique to, quote, impart the sensation of things as they are perceived and not as they are known, 1917, para 11 of 40. A counterforce to habitualization, which Shklovsky memorably describes as devouring all wonder. In presenting themselves as stories, mainstream video games tug in the opposite direction. They are filled with the sensation of things, and they need to be touched, seen, and heard to be brought to completion, but they labour to habituate the player to their alienness, to be perceived as comfortably familiar. By adopting the signification strategies of poetry, video games have the opportunity to embrace their own strangeness rather than seeking to neutralize it. Poetic devices such as the refrain, anaphora, epistrophe, and homeoteluton are forms of literary repetition that could be realized through the recycled surface textures, objects, and player actions within the world of the game as easily as through written language, should the developer of a video game wish to explore repetition and patterning as a path to meaning. To put it simply, the video game has historically evinced a predominant interest in becoming an advanced kind of story. It has yet to convincingly explore the possibility of becoming an advanced kind of poem, and such exploration can only add to the overall versatility of the medium. Additionally, the experiential augmentation that video games offer poetry runs the other way. Words by themselves retain a unique, near limitless expressive power, and may be used much more concertedly to give shape and meaning to those bodily sensations experienced by the player as they interface and coalesce with the world of the video game. We've reached a point now where poets and video game developers alike are starting to experiment with the possibilities just described. A video game today may boldly pronounce itself a poetic odyssey, while a poem published in a leading British journal may choose to take its central metaphor from Super Mario Bros. Occasionally, a young artist will choose to identify as both a poet and a video game developer. The tools required to make and publish video games are more widely and cheaply available than at any time before, while the visibility and centrality of contemporary poetry has been immeasurably enhanced by the proliferation of social media and easy-to-maintain web hosting platforms. Enough examples of poem-game interplay and hybridity now exist for the associated challenges and opportunities to be given thorough consideration. That was an extract from Dual Wield, the interplay of poetry and video games, written by me, John Stone, and published by De Gruyter.